Okay, we continue on with the story of the English Bible. Let me run through what I talked about last week real quickly. So last week we first looked at the efforts to render the Bible into Old English or Anglo-Saxon, which ran from Aldhelm's work on the Psalms beginning around AD 700 through the Wessex Gospels in the late 900s. Now, the Wessex Gospels, they were an actual translation from the Latin translation into Old English. And then after England was conquered in 1066, so that's Anglo-Saxon or Old English, after England's conquered by invaders from the region of Normandy, France, what's known as the Norman Conquest, well, that had a major impact on the English language. Old English was then transformed into what is known as Middle English, and the difference between the two was great enough that the earlier work on the Anglo-Saxon or Old English versions was obsolete. Now, the work of John Wycliffe in the latter part of the 14th century was a major turning point in the history of the English Bible. This Oxford-trained theologian who disagreed with certain teachings and practices of the Roman Catholic Church, he oversaw and probably participated in the translation of the complete Bible into English, albeit Middle English, a translation that was completed in 1382. It was based on the Vulgate. It was based on the Latin translation. Now, the initial translation, you'll recall, what is known as Wycliffe's version, was a woodenly literal translation. But soon after, you had Purvey's revision, which was much smoother, and that became very popular. And just to remind you that Wycliffe, he was quite... the Roman Catholic Church didn't look fondly on Wycliffe. They called his followers Lollards, and they persecuted them, some to the point of death, and copies of Wycliffe's Bible were systematically seized and burned. And the exclamation point on the church's hostility toward Wycliffe was their exhuming his body in 1428, 44 years after his death, burning his bones, and then throwing the ashes into the River Swift. Now that just lets you know they really, really didn't like this guy. Okay, he was considered a real threat. Now the modern English period, what we just got to at the end of the class, the modern English, so that's Middle English. You had Anglo-Saxon, Old English, that's Middle English. The modern English period began around 1500, and it followed the invention of the printing press, which was absolutely revolutionary. But the printing press by Johann Gutenberg in Mainz, Germany in the early 1450s. And as I said right at the end of the last class, when the Christian center in Constantinople fell to the Muslim Turks in 1453, you had many of the scholars there who were very familiar with Greek. They fled west, so they brought their expertise with them, and they also brought Greek manuscripts with them as they fled that situation. So that was beneficial. That led to a rebirth of Greek language studies in the West. And around this time, there was also a revival of Hebrew knowledge in the West. And both of those things go to benefit biblical studies. I mentioned that the first major book that was printed on the Gutenberg press was the Gutenberg Bible, which was the Bible in Latin. And then that's where we ended. So to pick back up, the Hebrew Bible. So you get the Gutenberg Bible, which is in Latin, but in 1488, you have the first Hebrew Bible printed in Soncino, Italy. Now that's important because if you want to be translating something, it's nice to have a printed version of the text to work off of. I don't have to go forage around and try to find manuscripts and do. So here we have the printed Hebrew Bible in 1488. Then in 1516, okay, this is 1488 Hebrew Bible, printing press early 1450s, 1488 Hebrew Bible, 1516, there's an edition of the Greek New Testament that had been put together by a scholar named Desiderius Erasmus. So he had 8 Greek manuscripts available to him, some of which had come from this westward flow after the fall of Constantinople. But he had 8 Greek manuscripts. Most of them you can see here. They are partial. They're all late. You see 12th century, 15th century, and they're partial. But he has these manuscripts available to them, so from those he is able to put together an entire New Testament, Matthew to Revelation. So he creates, and he's doing obviously some editing, because if you have 2 manuscripts of the same text, and if they differ, then you're going to have to do some text critical work and say, what was the original? But this is his edition. Okay, this is Erasmus's edition of the Greek New Testament that was printed in 1516, and here is a image of that, and he does it in parallel with Latin. So we finally now, so in 1488 we got a printed Hebrew Bible. Well, now we've got a printed Greek Bible, a New Testament. It's parallel, as I say, the right side Latin, the left side is the Greek text. So that's in 1516. Now, he does another edition of this in 1519. And in 1520, there's another printed edition of the Greek New Testament by a Catholic scholar and priest named Ximenes of Alcala, Spain. And though his edition was superior in terms of the Greek textual base, it was superior to the edition that Erasmus had put together. But Erasmus's became dominant because it was first to be printed. So he got there first, and that then became the dominant text that was translated. Now, William Tyndale is a towering figure in the history of the English Bible. Tyndale was born around 1494, right? So think Columbus, right? Columbus, 1490. Tyndale's born around 1494 in Gloucester, England. He receives his Master of Arts degree, so he's another scholar. He receives his Master of Arts degree from Oxford in 1515, and then he continued his study there for another 6 or 7 years. He was fluent in 8 languages: English, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, French, German, Spanish, and Italian. Now, Donald Brake, in his book on the history of the English Bible, he comments, he says, Tyndale became a scholar of the original Bible languages, an effective speaker, and a man determined to advocate the rights of common people to explore Scripture in their own language. Now, just to give you the sense of the time, in 1517, okay, so he graduates, Tyndale in 1515, he's going to stay at Oxford for another 6 or 7 years. But in 1517, the German theologian and professor Martin Luther, that's when he nailed his 95 theses or points of debate, that he nailed those theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany, which was a significant event in the Protestant Reformation. And then in 1522, Luther published his German translation of the New Testament, made from that Greek text that Erasmus had created and then had printed. But it was the second edition, from Erasmus's 1519 edition of the Greek text. In 1522, working from that text, Luther then gives the German people the New Testament in German. And so this set the stage, right, for somebody to do the same thing for English-speaking people. Now, the entire Bible, so Luther gives the German people the New Testament in 1522. The Germans got the entire Bible in German in 1534. That translation of the Old Testament was done by Luther and a number of other scholars. Now, given the hostility that still existed in England toward translating the Bible into English, Tyndale, he went to Germany in 1524, and he translated the New Testament there in Germany from Greek into English. So he is the first person to take the Greek New Testament and translate it into English. And when he tried to have his work, his English translation of the New Testament, printed in Cologne, Germany in 1525, the city senate banned the project. They put the kibosh on it because they had been tipped off about it by an enemy of the Reformation. So they said, "You're not printing that here." And so he wasn't able to get it printed there, but Tyndale, he succeeded in having a handheld size edition, what is called an octavo, of the English New Testament, printed in Worms, Germany in 1526. So here we have the New Testament in English, translated from the Greek text. And here you have the Gospel of John, and then here's a close-up of the Tyndale edition of the New Testament. You see the Gospel of St. John. You see it's still not that easy to read, right? The first chapter, in the beginning was the Word, and that Word was God, and God was that Word. And then here's a close-up of Matthew in the Tyndale New Testament. The Gospel of St. Matthew, first chapter. This is the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son also of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac, and goes on. So here we have we have this translation, Tyndale's work here that he has done. Now, that's in 1526. He succeeds in getting that printed in Worms, Germany. Now, that same year, in 1526, Bishop Cuthbert Tunstall of London, he began seizing and burning copies of Tyndale's New Testament as they were smuggled into England. This ought to remind you of how Wycliffe's translation was treated. But here they seized them and they burned them, and he punished all the offenders he could find, people who were involved in this. Now, despite that persecution, New Testaments, Tyndale's New Testaments, poured into England. And it just shows you how hungry people were to actually be able to see the Bible in their own language. And so it just poured in there. And this version, Tyndale's New Testament, was so popular that pirated copies were being sold. In other words, you'd have printers would get this and say, "Everybody wants this thing. Well, I'm running it." And then they'd go sell them. Okay, in secret, so they couldn't get caught, but they would go sell them. And that just is a tribute to how popular it was. Now, so that's 1526. They come in, they start burning them and all that stuff. Now, in 1528, 2 years later, Tyndale published 2 books that were contrary to Catholic teaching. The first criticized the Catholic Church's overemphasis on works, and the second criticized corruptions and superstitions of the Catholic Church. Both of those books that Tyndale wrote in 1528 were widely read, and they were immediately condemned as heretical. So you can see he's already in a serious clash here. In 1529, the year after Tyndale wrote those 2 books, Sir Thomas More, who was a powerful counselor to King Henry VIII, he published a work titled Dialogue Concerning Heresies, in the 3rd book of which he attacked Tyndale's translation as heretical. As David Daniel says, at bottom, More asserts in his attack that Tyndale's offense, what he did wrong, had been to give the people Paul in English. How dare he do that? and to translate key words in their Greek meanings as senior, congregation, love, and repent, instead of the church's preferred renderings of those words: priest, church, charity, and do penance. See, so that in their view, that those translations are corrupting the truth. You see, so this is what the gist of Moore's complaint about Tyndale's translation. Well, Tyndale, the following, or 2 years later, in 1531, he publishes a response to Moore's work, and then the following year, in 1532, Moore publishes a massive and very intemperate reply to Tyndale's response. Now, Tyndale, he revised his New Testament, and so he prints it in 1526, he revises it in 1534, and again in 1535. And sometimes we say, well, if you translate, why do you revise it? Well, then you've never done any translating work. Because, you know, when you're working on translations, sometimes you see things or you learn things that say, well, this is better. I think this can be better expressed. Okay, so if you've ever done that and you go back and look at what you did before, you see, that's why you have editions, modern English versions. They're always being revised, as we'll see, Lord willing, next week. You see, because people become convinced that I think this could be said better, or we've learned more about nuances of this word, or that kind of thing. So he had published 2 different editions in 1534 and 1535. Then in 1535, while Tyndale is living in exile, essentially hiding in Antwerp, Belgium, a city under the jurisdiction of Charles V. Now, Charles V is a powerful, in fact, he's a Roman emperor, not the Pope, but he is a powerful and staunch Roman Catholic. He was, in fact, the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. All right, so Catherine of Aragon, she was Henry VIII's first wife. And this guy is her nephew. Now, Catherine of Aragon, England's King Henry VIII, he had unsuccessfully, for years, he had pushed, 6 years, something like that, he had pushed Pope Clement VII to issue an annulment of his marriage to Catherine. And the Pope, it was unsuccessful, the Pope refused, but in January of 1533, Henry defied the Catholic Church. The Pope saying, you're not getting an annulment. Now, part of the reason he wouldn't do that was how powerful Charles V was, who's the nephew of Catherine. Okay? So, no, you're not going to get this. Well, in January of 1533, Henry VIII defies the Catholic Church, and he secretly marries Anne Boleyn. And then 5 months later, after he has arranged to have Thomas Cranmer appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, 5 months after his secret marriage to Anne Boleyn, Cranmer then annuls his marriage to Catherine. Okay? So you can see Catherine is not too fond of how she's been treated, and this guy is her nephew. Well, the Pope then, so that's in 1533, the Pope excommunicates Henry VIII, and then the next year in 1534, the Church of England formally separates from the Catholic Church. This is the English Reformation, okay? It takes kind of a different track. It formally separates institutional authority. So now we have the Church of England and you have the Roman Catholic Church. And that was all geared around this divorce or this annulment that he wanted. It was no fun being married to Henry VIII, as you'll see in a second. But in May of 1535, Tyndale was sold out. He was betrayed by a supposed friend, a man named Henry Phillips. He was arrested by authorities, and he was thrown into a dungeon in a castle in Vilvoorde, which is outside of Brussels. And I'm talking your classic dungeon. That's where he's tossed. And from that prison, And no doubt realizing the fate in store for him, Tyndale wrote the following letter in 1535 to the governor of the castle. So he writes to the guy who runs the castle, and he's going to ask this guy to get to the guy who's in charge of his imprisonment and have him do some things for him. But here's what Tyndale says. I believe, most excellent sir, that you're not unacquainted with the decision reached concerning me. On which account I beseech your lordship, even by the Lord Jesus, that if I am to pass the winter here, to urge upon the Lord Commissary, if he will deign, to send me from my goods in his keeping a warmer cap. For I suffer greatly from cold in the head, being troubled with continued catarrh, mucus buildup, I had to look that up, which is aggravated in this prison vault. Now, as somebody who spends most of his life freezing to death, this really hits me. This guy's in this dungeon thinking about the wintertime here in this place in Vilvoorde, outside of Brussels, and he's freezing. He says, a warmer coat also, for that which I have is very thin. Also cloth for repairing my leggings. My overcoat is worn out. The shirts also are worn out. He has a woolen shirt of mine, if he will please send it. I have also with him leggings of heavier cloth for overwear. He likewise has warmer nightcaps. Now listen to this. This to me is just pitiful. He says, I also ask for leave to use a lamp in the evening, for it is tiresome to sit alone in the dark. Now here's this guy in this dungeon up there where I'm sure it's getting dark early. And he's sitting in there and he's got to ask, can I have any kind of light? Because it's just really a drag to be sitting in the pitch dark. Right? This guy he has so much to contribute. But he goes on. He says, but above all, I beg and entreat your clemency earnestly to intercede with the Lord Commissary that he would deign to allow me to use my Hebrew Bible, Hebrew grammar, and Hebrew lexicon, and that I might employ my time with that study. This guy had a ministry of study, a ministry of scholarship. However much we may turn our nose up at that, you and I reap the benefit of this kind of thing. Okay, so he says, thus likewise may you obtain what you most desire, saving that it further the salvation of your soul. But if before the end of winter a different decision be reached concerning me, I shall be patient and submit to the will of God, to the glory of the grace of Jesus Christ my Lord, whose Spirit may ever direct your heart. Amen. I'm just thinking, this guy here now, this guy's crying. What has he done? Is he in here for butchering people or something? No, he's translating the Bible. And he's expressing his disagreement with the Roman Catholic Church. And they absolutely are not fans of that. And I just look at this guy who was enduring this for that. Well, in August of 1536, Tyndale was found guilty of heresy, which is no surprise. And on October 6, 1536, he was at around the age of 42 years, tied to a stake, strangled from behind, and then burned. And his final words were reported to have been, Lord, open the King of England's eyes. And you see that portrayed in this from Fox's Book of Martyrs. But you see, Lord, back there, open the King of England's eyes. And so here is another person who is killed. Now, Miles Coverdale, who was a friend and a follower of Tyndale, he was the first person to translate the entire Bible. Tyndale did the New Testament. He was the first person to translate the entire Bible into modern English, right? Wycliffe had done it into Middle English. Tyndale did the New Testament in English. Well, he's the first person to translate the entire Bible, Old and New Testaments, into modern English. The pages were printed in Antwerp, but they were bound in England by an English bindery because English law required that. Now, since Coverdale did not know, he didn't know Hebrew or Greek. Coverdale didn't know either one. You say, well, how did he he translated from Luther's German translation. So he obviously knew German. He knew German and English, so that would help him. He had Luther's translation, and he had the Vulgate, so he knew Latin. So he working from Latin, working from German, and he made extensive use of Tyndale's translation. Right? If you've translated, you know this is how, like if you're working on a text today, you're going to look at all of the translations to see how all the scholars and people have rendered these particular phrases, because it'll give you clues. And so he's got Luther's German, he's got the Latin, and then he has the benefit of Tyndale's work, not only Tyndale's work on the New Testament, but Tyndale had also done work on the Pentateuch, on Jonah, and on some of the historical books. So that's his pool. German, Latin, and English, based on Tyndale's work. And in his translation, what he's emphasizing is readability. He wants to make it something that's smooth, that people can really read, rather than emphasizing a close correspondence to the original languages. Now, Coverdale, he put the apocryphal books. You remember the Vulgate? That was translated, has apocryphal books, but they're scattered throughout. Well, what happens here is Coverdale, he pulls out the apocryphal books, groups them together, and publishes them between the Old and New Testaments. Okay, so he's the first one. He pulls them out and separates them and puts them in between, declaring that they were not to be considered as authoritative as other books of the Bible, and that they were not found in the canon of the Hebrews. In other words, the ancient Jews did not consider those books inspired. So he pulls them out, publishes them separately between the two, the Old and New Testament, and that's how the Apocrypha was printed in Protestant Bibles. Okay, old Protestant Bibles included the Apocrypha, but they included them between the Old and New Testaments to indicate, hey, there's something different about these books. And then along the line, in Protestant Bibles, they were eventually dropped. The idea being, if you wanted to go look at them, you could look at another publication. But they were simply dropped. So in our Protestant Bibles, you simply now have Old Testament and New Testament. Now, unlike Tyndale, Coverdale, he had cultivated powerful friends. Okay? Never underestimate that, right? I mean, he had cultivated powerful friends like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas More, which allowed him to survive as a translator. Right? They killed Tyndale. But he's over here translating stuff and allowed him to survive. Now, Henry VIII's second wife. Okay, so he marries Catherine of Aragon, then he marries Anne Boleyn, and then has his marriage to Catherine annulled by Cranmer. So Anne Boleyn is Henry VIII's second wife. And his second wife supported Coverdale's work. And in fact, Coverdale mentions Anne Boleyn in the dedication of his Bible, no doubt in an attempt to suck up to Henry VIII, in the hope that he would officially authorize Coverdale's version. See, so that it could then be legally circulated and read. So that's what he was hoping. But unfortunately for Coverdale, and more unfortunately for Anne, Henry had Anne executed the following year in 1536. And then he married Jane Seymour, his third wife, and made her the new queen. So as I say, it's difficult being married to Henry here. But he has her killed. So Henry's not likely to authorize a translation that had been so identified with Anne, right? She's mentioned in the dedication. She supports Coverdale's work. He's thinking that's a good thing. I'll get on his good side. I'll be for. Little does he know, she's getting whacked the next year. And he's taking a new wife. So that makes that unlikely. But it's interesting, because the following year in 1537, a slightly revised version of Coverdale's translation was printed in England by a man named James Nicholson, and it was printed with the declaration set forth with the king's most gracious license. So somehow he had gained permission in his particular slight revision that he's printing, and I don't know the ins and outs of that, what all went on, that somehow this printer's able to do this and get this, able to put this in here. But the point is that we now at last, there's an English translation available that met the requirements of the notorious constitutions, if you remember, from 1408. The constitutions that prohibited anyone from translating the Bible into English unless without the express supervision of the church, and prohibited anyone from reading the Bible in English. Well, now we got a version that is licensed by the king. Well, now it's legal. Now it's legal to go ahead and circulate and read it. So you have that. Now, John Rogers, he was educated at Cambridge. You remember, Tyndale was from Oxford. John Rogers was educated at Cambridge, and he was a friend of William Tyndale. So he took the pseudonym Thomas Matthew to conceal his identity and therefore to conceal his relationship to Tyndale. And so Tyndale's killed, right, in 1536. And in 1537, he had Rogers had an English translation of the Bible. He has it published under that name of Thomas Matthew. And it is, unsurprisingly, known as the Matthew's Bible, or sometimes the Matthew Bible. And it was an edited compilation of Tyndale and Coverdale's work. So remember, Coverdale did his Bible based on the German, the Latin, and Tyndale's work. And so now we have John Rogers doing an edited compilation, taking what he thought was best from Coverdale and Tyndale and putting them together and creating a translation. And then Henry VIII, on the request of his chief official, Thomas Cromwell, he gave that translation his formal and official blessing, which is ironic, right? And consider how fiercely the church and Henry had opposed Tyndale's work. Tyndale drove him crazy. They killed him. Well, here's Tyndale's work essentially coming in. Right? So it's authorized there, and you see here set forth with the king's most gracious license. You see it printed right down at the bottom of the title page here of this rendering. So now England has two authorized English Bibles. It has the slight revision of the Coverdale, the 1537 edition, printed by that fellow Nicholson, and now it has this, the Matthew or Matthew's Bible. So we have two. Now, Richard Taverner, he was a scholar in Hebrew and Greek. So he prepares a revision based on his knowledge. So he's looking at what they did, checking the Greek and the Hebrew. So he prepares a revision of the Matthew's Bible, and his was printed in 1539, known as the Taverner Bible. It was printed in 1539, shortly before the publication of another Bible called the Great Bible. So here's Taverner's translation, this revision of the Matthew's Bible, and for whatever reason, his Bible never really took off. It never really gained much traction. It had almost no influence on subsequent translations. And that's just how life and history go, you know. So he does this work, has it, but it just for some reason didn't click. Now, some of the church leaders, they weren't satisfied with either Coverdale's work or the Matthew's Bible, the latter being opposed mainly because of its notes. It's annotations, okay? We sit here and explain little things. Well, they didn't like some of the angles that he took, okay? But they weren't happy with either the Coverdale or Matthew's Bible. So through using Cromwell, right, this chief official of Henry VIII, through Cromwell, they got Henry VIII to agree to authorize another translation. And Cromwell chose his friend Coverdale to do that translation. And in 1539, the Bible was published that is known as the Great Bible. So here we have 1539. This is Coverdale's work, and it's known as the Great Bible. Now, this was not a translation from the original languages. This wasn't from the Hebrew and Aramaic and from the Greek. Coverdale, he relied heavily on Latin texts, which shouldn't surprise us from the work he did in the Coverdale Bible. But he relied heavily on the Latin text, on Tyndale's translation, and on the Matthew's Bible, right? So anytime you have somebody who's competent, who's working on something, and they produce a Bible, well, you want to consult that. And so that's what he's doing. He's got the Latin, he's got Tyndale, and now he's got the Matthew's Bible. And he produces this Bible from those, and it is called the Great Bible because of its massive size. The thing was 16.5 inches by 11 inches. And when you have the thick pages there and a full Bible, this is a beast. Okay, so it's called the Great Bible for that reason. And it was extremely influential. And since Coverdale prepared that Bible at the request of Thomas Cromwell, the Great Bible is also sometimes known as Cromwell's Bible. Okay, now here is Thomas Cromwell, who's the chief official. He was a powerful proponent of the English Reformation, but there you have. So in 1539, the Great Bible, also known as Cromwell's Bible. But beginning with the 1540, so that's 1539, the very next year, beginning with that edition of the Great Bible, the 1540 edition, well, it now had a preface that was written by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so that edition is known as Cranmer's Bible. All right, 1539, Great Bible, Cromwell's Bible, 1540 edition of that Great Bible, also known as Cranmer's Bible, because Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, wrote a preface to it. And here you see, so that's Thomas Cranmer, and here is a picture, or a portrait of Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, under Henry VIII, under Edward VI, and then under Mary for a short time, as I'll explain in a bit. And he's another leader of the English Reformation. But despite this spurt of English translations during this 5-year period, the forces that were opposed to the Reformation and opposed to printing the Bible in English, they were still there. They hadn't gone away. They had just gotten quiet and gone underground. Others would pay with their lives for their commitment to these causes. Now, Henry VIII, he dies in January of 1547, and he was succeeded by King Edward VI, who was his 9-year-old son from his third wife, Jane Seymour, right? Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour. So these two had girls. You've got Jane Seymour has Edward. Edward comes to the throne after Henry VIII dies. And though Henry had severed the formal link, the authority link between the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England, Henry VIII never permitted the renunciation of Catholic doctrine or ceremony. It was during the reign of Edward VI that Protestantism was established for the first time in England, with reforms that included the abolition of clerical celibacy and the Mass, and the imposition of compulsory services in English. Now, those things are very Protestant reforms that were brought in, and the architect of those reforms with this young ruler, the man behind the curtain, was the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. Now, no new English translations were made during his short reign, but upon Edward's death in 1533, Mary, who was, you remember, she's the daughter of Henry and Catherine of Aragon, the one Henry had kissed off and annulled the marriage. Well, she now ascends to the throne, and she fervently embraced the Catholicism of her mother, and she instituted anti-Protestant reforms. She revived that 1401. So this is in 1553. She revives that 1401 law, De Heretico Comburendo, which prescribed death by burning for heretics, and she intensely persecuted Protestants, which earned her the nickname Bloody Mary. Now, John Rogers, the man who behind the Matthew's Bible, he was the first to suffer martyrdom under Mary. He was burned at the stake in 1555, and she had nearly 300 people burned or beheaded, including such notable men as these former Anglican bishops, Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, those who are known as the Oxford Martyrs, and the deposed Archbishop of Canterbury, the man behind the reforms, Thomas Cranmer. He too gets killed. Now, as you might imagine, many of England's greatest scholars and theologians, when this is going on, well, they fled to Europe, specifically to Switzerland and Germany, where the Reformation, it was more deeply and broadly established. And these exiles, while they're in exile during Mary's reign, they recognize the need for an English translation that would be printed with the new verse divisions. See, that was something new. So now, so we have text now with verse divisions, so we need to have a translation that has the verse divisions in it, and also that needs to have more modern Latin or Roman type instead of this heavy Gothic or Old English type. And so they recognize that. And in Geneva, William Whittingham, who is a Greek scholar, he prepared a revision of a recent edition of Tyndale's New Testament using the verse divisions that Robert Stephanus, who's also known as Robert Estienne, he had introduced into the fourth edition of his Greek text of 1551. So in 1551, Robert Stephanus publishes a Greek text that has verse divisions in it. And so working from that Greek text, William Whittingham, he produces an English translation of the New Testament that now has those verse divisions in it. And that work is called the Geneva New Testament, and it was printed in 1557. And this was the first new translation since the Great Bible in 1539. So what is that? That winds up being 18 years. So we have that gap here, 18 years. We'll finish next week. I'm pretty sure of that. Lord willing, thanks for hanging in.